Hello, this is David Bernstein. I'm the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and this is the Jewish Contrarians podcast. And I'm here with my usual partner in thought crime, Brandy Shafetinsky. Hello, Brandy.
Hey, David.
So, Brandy is in some nondescript hotel in California getting ready to do her thing. Brandy, you are going to be moderating a discussion on a film. What's going on in Northern California?
We are having a premiere screening of Eli Steele's latest phenomenal documentary called Killing America that really takes a deep dive in what's happening in a specific school district up here in Northern California, but it's very similar to what we're seeing happen in districts across the country. He looks at what's the connections between growing anti-Semitism and the eradication of merit-based standards in education. He spoke with some students, some teachers, some parents in the local district. So we're really excited to be screening that. And we have a great panel that's going to be also answering some questions that I'm posing to them. And then that participants, attendees will also have the opportunity to ask some questions.
So correct me if I'm wrong, this elicited some controversy prior to the screening.
Like many things that we take part in, David. I mean, I think that there a lot of people are a little bit gun shy because they falsely believe that because maybe we don't prescribe to their ideological orthodoxy, that we're extremists on the other side, when that in fact isn't the case. And
yes,
honestly, the whole point of this documentary, like most documentaries should be, is to really tell a story and expose things that are going on. At the end of the documentary, I really hope that viewers walk away with maybe more questions than thinking, oh yes, and here's a concrete plan that's very rigid and what we need to do next.
Yes, I think that's a really interesting observation. It's one that I've been reflecting on a lot, which is that when we elicit controversy or vote controversy, it's assumed that somehow we're at fault, that we're saying or doing something extremist, which is really, it's almost the exact opposite. It's the people who are saying, you're saying something I don't want to hear. And so, or that's going to upset others. So you should shut down and stop being extremist. And in a way, they're exhibiting the very extremism that they're accusing us of by trying to shut down the discussion.
Yeah. And I mean, it also, to me, it just raises the question, what are they so afraid of? A conversation? I think that that's an odd thing to be so afraid of a conversation that you shut it down. And I also think it's kind of reflective of what we're seeing happen on campuses, where speakers, like what the recent controversy with a professor who came to speak to students about peace between Israel and Palestinians, and he was shouted down to the effect that they canceled the event. And it's that whole idea that we're so worried and afraid of discussion, we're going to shout it down and shut it down.
Right. So before I go into my epic rant about the topic at hand today, I want to share just another frustration that I've had recently. So I was in a meeting with somebody from sort of the organized Jewish community, who in a way, in a very subtle American Jewish way, castigated us for some of the controversies and supposed insults. I don't even know what those said insults are, just that there were supposed insults or insulting things that we might have said going back, in our founding and the like. And, at some point I just said, I'm sure we've said something that could have been said differently, al hate, as we say on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. But we were nowhere near as wrong as you and others who castigated us for telling a truth that people weren't ready to hear. We were the ones that said, we've got the problem with an ideology on the left that's gaining ground, that's dividing people neatly into oppressed and oppressors, and is labeling Jews as oppressors. We said it. You castigated us for saying it. And now you're blaming us for insulting people way back when. And so somehow we're not a worthy partner now because we might have upset you back when we were right and you were wrong. I mean, I sometimes I'm like speechless at some of what comes out of people's mouths. And, even now, post October 7th.
I think it's better you have those conversations than I mean, I don't, of course, there are times that I'm going to say something or post something in. I mean, anything that I say could be said differently. I said it this way because I'm me. and I'm not proclaiming perfection in how,
Right.
I'm the best communicator in the world. This is how I communicate, and sometimes it works and many times it doesn't. But that's not a reason to kind of kill the message or ignore the
Yeah.
message that we have a problem that needs to be addressed, and we're not the only ones saying it. We're hearing growing concern and louder calls for it to be addressed by the wider Jewish communities in America. And I'm sure that kind of goes right into what we're going to discuss today.
Yes, it
But
does.
just because we could have said it differently doesn't mean that what we're saying is something that should be ignored.
If anything, I would think that you would say, listen, guys, thank you for warning us of something that we should have seen and many of us sort of understood but didn't want to talk about. Thank you for putting yourself on the front line at that time. And then if you want to critique us, it will be a little easier to stomach and hear. Yes. By the way, it was interesting that the ADL just came out with this new survey of public opinion on Jews. And one of the questions that it asked that I had never seen asked on an ADL survey is, to what degree did people who divided up the world neatly into oppressed oppressors also have anti-Semitic attitudes? And not surprisingly, it showed that they're much more likely to have anti-Semitic attitudes than people who don't. So I thought that was very telling, and it shows that the mainstream organizations are starting to understand something is amiss in this discourse. All right, so the topic at hand, we wanted to talk about is there a growing disconnect between rank and file American Jews and these mainstream organizations? And my hypothesis is yes. And I'm going to say why I think that's the truth. And somebody, smart alecky person, is going to say, you don't have data to prove it. And I will acknowledge I don't have data to prove it. It's based on experience. But even if there was data that I could cite, I'm not sure it would still do justice, or that even went in the other direction, to what we're seeing and why I think that there's a growing disconnect. And I'll explain that in a second. So I've been, like you have, Brandy, traveling around the country, speaking to different Jewish audiences, mainstream organizations a lot of times. And I did Columbus, Ohio 4 times. Thank you, Daniel Newman, who helped put that all together. I did northern Miami Beach with my friend David Hazoni. I did Brooklyn just the other night with a group of Russian Jews, a Russian Jewish audience of like 100 plus people. So I'm coming to contact with a lot of American Jews, very often mainstream left-wing American Jews. And here's what I keep on hearing from people. I keep on hearing that they are in a state of intellectual and moral crisis over October 7th, and it's meaning to them. One woman who I was told I should be aware of, she's a high-powered attorney at a law firm, and she's very progressive, and we don't want to alienate her. I was told that by a Jewish professional who was gracious enough to offer me a platform. When we got to her, she said, I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know where I fit in. When I spoke at Ohio State Chabad the other night, I had a wonderful talk, and I was so energized by the conversation I had with about 50 Jewish students who might have come there for the free spaghetti and meatballs more than they did to hear David Bernstein. But be that as it may, I was so energized by the conversation. So many of them were actually taking it seriously and understood that things had changed. And I got almost zero flack, by the way. And these are not really Orthodox students. These are just, secular Jewish kids, or Reform or conservative Jewish kids mostly. There was this one young woman, and Dan was there with me, so he can attest to this really happened. Young woman said, I came here because I heard your title of your book, Woke Anti-Semitism. And I thought you were going to be a right winger, and I was going to take you on for being this right winger. And then I realized that everything you said, actually, I agreed with. And I'm going through my own intellectual and political crisis. She may not have used those words. My own problem with, all the liberal groups that I've always been with, who have sort of turned their back on me and turned their back on Israel. And I don't know where I fit in. I'm really struggling. And so that's what I'm hearing over and over again. Now, that's part one. Part two. I think the organized Jewish community, the institutions, the defense organizations that I would argue probably were asleep at the wheel during the lead up to October 7th, that did not provide adequate warning to the Jewish community that this ideology was taking root, that oftentimes bought into it as a way of just staying aligned with their traditional progressive coalition partners. that they know, their leadership often knows that something is amiss, that they could tell you, I'm sure they would, that there's an oppressor ideology at work here. They're now admitting in a way, at least behind closed doors. But what they're not doing is doing anything differently. And I think that they're stuck for a variety of reasons. One, I think that they're worried fundamentally about alienating stakeholders, particularly progressive stakeholders. So if you're worried about DEI and you're thinking about DEI and you might have a problem with DEI, you don't want to say it because you're worried that the NAACP leader that you've been working with for many years might get angry at you for saying it. So as a result, you don't actually say what you think about it. You sort of revert back to your old stance. I have to tell you, and when I was in one of those communities, I met with this woman who'd been very active with the Jewish Federation. And we were talking about the relationships that the Jewish community needs to build in the sort of the post-October 7th era, maybe with Asians, maybe with heterodox Black Americans and Latinos and others that really don't want to engage in that sort of radical social justice ideology. These are our new friends. We have to get to know them, build them up. And she agreed with everything. She agreed that there needs to be changes made, right? And we talked about what some of those changes were. And then, and this is really telling, okay? And then you'll tell me why I'm wrong, as you sometimes do. So what she said to me was, well, I'm very concerned about cutting off ties with anybody in some of the previous groups. So you don't have to do that. You don't have to do that unless they're requiring something of you that you shouldn't give. They're requiring you to sign up for the ethnic studies program or for the DEI program that that they're requiring you to stay silent about these things. And you don't want to stay silent. Otherwise, but you also should ask yourself, where should we spend the resources? And by the time we were done with this conversation, I realized that she was talking herself and her institution into doing nothing differently. And she was saying that, well, in the end of the day, some groups have to continue those relationships with the progressives. And I realized what's happening here is that all of those mainstream organizations will say, we have to be the organization that keeps a door open to progressives. And they'll all cluster around doing that one thing. And nobody will actually make the October 8th pivot that needs to be done and build all these new relationships, except people like us. But we're just small. Yeah, some will, but we're the ones who are out there, on the front lines, and they're going to leave it to us, and they're going to do everything that they always did. And that's what's going to create a disconnect. People, the rank and file, and then I'm going to shut up. The rank and file Jews who have been, who are going through their own intellectual and social crisis and change and transformation, will start to sense that these institutions no longer represent their interests anymore because they haven't made the same change. What do you think?
I mean, I think we're already seeing it. And I'm not going to publicly smear or bad talk an organization. I don't think it's necessary, and I think it's the right thing to do. But I think we're already seeing it with the conversations, at least I am, the conversations that I have with people when I give talks, just regular conversations over coffee, where people say, I tried to call X organization and they didn't do anything. Or what I'm seeing actually increasingly is in the WhatsApp groups, all of these WhatsApp groups that we're all a part of. When people say, who should I call this happened? And people are saying explicitly, do not call X organization. They don't do anything. Instead, call. And they list off some of the smaller, newer, more ragtag organizations that are on the front lines. I mean, I'm seeing happen increasingly. And I mean, this is where I'm more of a pessimist than you, David. I think that that's fine. I think that if an organization doesn't know what to do, I would prefer that they don't try to do it because they won't do it well. The problem that I have is then when they stop those organizations who do know what to do, when they try to block us from doing what we are able to do, what we know needs to be done, and the things that we do well.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. I'm also hearing, though, and I know I'm still stuck in this rant about these organizations because ultimately a lot of resources, communal resources, are going into these institutions. I mean, I'd like some of that money so that we can actually respond to the challenges at hand, right? So maybe that's part of my complaint. And I don't mind doing fewer of those things if those organizations step in and relieve us of some of those those duties. Like, we don't have to do everything we're doing. We can say, okay, you got this covered. We'll go and concentrate on X. But they're not doing that. They're not stepping into the breach. Maybe some of them are just big ships that are taking a while to change. I'm open to that possibility, but I'm not seeing a lot of good signs. I'm seeing a lot of very big rationalizations happening in the various conversations I have. And so, but I do think that that this shift continues among the rank and file. There was this poll taken in New York State of Jewish voters in New York, and it showed that 55% were going to vote for Trump. Now, we're not here to talk about partisan politics or endorse a candidate or anything like that. God forbid, many of us, are even with that might still vote the way we've always voted. But that said, that tells you something. I don't know exactly what the New York Jewish vote was in 2020. I was trying to find that information, but couldn't find it. Maybe one of our good listeners will be good enough to email it to me at david@jilv.org. That said, I know that that's a sign of some shift, because I can tell you it wasn't 55-45 in favor of Trump in 2020. And so I think that there's a huge shift taking place, and that these organizations are going to find themselves really fundamentally alienated from their own core constituencies if they don't start to move in those directions.
I think they already are, but for the funding and resources that go to them. And I mean, sometimes the messages take a long time to kind of trickle up versus trickling down. And I think that that's a bit of what we're seeing. And again, I think the countering anti-Semitism, providing education on Jewish peoplehood isn't partisan. So the idea that we have to appeal to the progressives or we have to appeal to the conservatives, that already is a self-made obstacle in actually countering anti-Semitism and educating about Jewish peoplehood. And that's an obstacle that I prefer not to build. It doesn't make any sense. We're not a gang where we have to follow this rigid ideology and do everything for our gang or our team. As far as partisan politics and fighting anti-Semitism, I think that it's a mistake. And I think we're unfortunately seeing some of the repercussions of continuing down that path for so many years, where people think that they have to stay only with this small crowd because they always have.
Yeah. So I was, when I was speaking to the group of Jews from the former Soviet Union in Brooklyn the other night, I anticipated this question. It actually doesn't have to be from them. It can be from anybody who says, well, okay, we've been burned by the left. We should join the right. And my message to them is that the October 8th Jew is politically independently minded. It's not about partisan. It's not about being permanently part of one party, one ideological camp or other. The October 8th Jew realizes that there's no safe harbor in a political camp. You may, and I worry that that's the psychology that some people are going to adopt. And it's very hard for people to do that. And I realize when I visit other diaspora communities, even our northern neighbor, Canada, that other diaspora communities are not nearly joined at the hip in the way that the American Jewish community is to the left and to the Democratic Party. Like, they have that collective psychology down. They don't see either party or any of the parties really being a permanent place for them to hang their hat. They know that there could be changing winds. And so what happens, of course, is that they can, if they do psychologically link, let's say, to the right, they're not also aware of how things might change, just like the left didn't realize how things were changing. So you may love Candace Owens when she completely agrees with you, or she says something that's flamboyant in your favor, but then all of a sudden, anybody who's willing to engage in that kind of rhetoric in your favor can engage in rhetoric like that in your disfavor, because they're not rationalists. They're dogmatic. And all of a sudden now she's, gone off the deep end. Or you could say the same about Tucker Carlson. You're going to put all your your eggs in the Tucker Carlson basket. Well, all of a sudden he's bending the knee to Putin. So is that what you want? And I told that to a group of Russian Jews who, of course, looked at me and they're like, "Yeah, we didn't like that." So that's the mindset I'm trying to get in their head. What do you think?
I think it's a good thing to focus on. I think part of the problem is that's more of a statement to me with American politics than with Jewish American communities, because American politics for a long time has been always vote red or always vote blue. It's never looking at, well, what's the policy? What is this leader's policy position? Our two-party system, I think,
It's
makes
very
that,
binary, isn't it? Yeah.
yes. And so once you get into that kind of, our society gets like buys into that binary, it's hard to break. And that's what I'm finding. I think that's more of a testament to that system than just, American Jews.
Yeah. To steel man their argument for a second, though, and I've heard people make these cases before, they'll say, listen, you don't, at least for a period of time, you should really get fully behind a party or a camp, because otherwise you're not going to be effective. Otherwise you have no base. That's how our system works. So the Chris Rufos of the world will say, look, if you want to push back against woke ideology, you got to join the Republican Party, because that's the vehicle that exists. And it may mean that you need to sacrifice other ideals in the process, but you need to join us if you really want this to go away. That's what he argues. And there are people in the Jewish community who've been saying that for a long time and say, look, okay, you don't like the policy of reproductive rights in the Republican Party or church-state separation. I get it. I might even agree with you, but you've got to join with the Republicans if you want to support Israel, because they're the more pro-Israel party these days. And I understand the argument, and I'm not saying that people in any given election shouldn't be willing to go one way or the other on a party in that way, because ultimately you might only have two choices. But at the end of the day, I think that it's the psychology of open-mindedness and not thinking that we're joined at the hip with either party, and the ability to pivot when we need to pivot.
I agree with that. I also think that sometimes, like we were saying a couple of minutes ago, the message trickling up takes a longer time. And in order to speed that up, sometimes people have to lose. Sometimes leaders and parties have to lose elections to understand that you were not listening to us, so we're not voting for you this time. Maybe we will next time, but you need to show that you're going to actually not necessarily do everything that we're saying, but you're actually going to acknowledge what we've been saying. And I think sometimes people have to learn a lesson by losing.
Yes, that's true too. And American Jews have to be willing to let that happen to a degree. Obviously, at a presidential level, that can be a dangerous game, because the person you might end up electing could do great damage, in one direction or the other. So, so it's hard to just say, well, I'm going to punish you because you get one against my interest, when you know that the person you might be inadvertently helping to elect might do even more damage to your interest in another way.
I agree. And I honestly would argue that that's a little bit of what has been happening. So right now it's more about punishment and retribution versus looking at what's in the best interest of the communities that we're parts of and the like. I think that this shouldn't be about punishment. It needs to be about, this is what we agree with. These are some of the policies that we want to see put into action for these reasons, and seeing what leaders have the courage to get behind those things, regardless of whether there's a D, R, or I behind their name.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to go back to something that you said that I sort of didn't give enough airtime to. You made the point that it's not necessarily just about trying to get those mainstream organizations to, get with the program. It would be great if they were, but you don't want them if they're not capable of doing it in the first place, or don't have the personnel in place. But it frustrates you, and it obviously frustrates me a great deal, when those organizations actually say, my game is the only game in town, and what they're doing is bad. And I have to say, I think that's such, like the person I described in the beginning that I had encountered, who was sort of blaming us for being right. I mean, come on, guys. Okay, at the very least, if you think we're the bad cop and you're the good cop, then don't bash us. Tell your people behind the scenes, yeah, they're the bad cop and we're the good cop in this. Fine. I might disagree with you, and I might think that there's way, 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 way too much good cop and not nearly enough bad cop. But at the least, have the humility not to think that everybody needs to be the good cop. And yet, I mean, I'm sure that there's some of that too. I mean, I'm not saying that the mainstream organizations are all doing that, but we see it so often where these people are telling their minions that those guys are doing harm to our agenda because they're not going along. And that's with things like DEI. You see that all the time. Look, if you want to argue that DEI has served the interests of the Jewish people, go ahead. But at least when there are groups like ours who are saying, I'm sorry, that's not true, and we're offering an alternative to engagement of the current radical DEI framework, at least say, well, I'm glad that they're doing that, even if that's not our stance. But unfortunately, that's not the line we usually get.
I think that I mean, goes to show that there's more at play than a disagreement in ideology and approach. It's ego. And I've said this before. You don't like when I say it, but I'm going to say it anyway. David, you could be doing a victory, and I told you so victory lap, right? Like in multiple places right now. But to me, it's not about that. It's about, we recognize there's a problem. Sure, some people didn't think it was going to be. That's fine. I'm not faulting anybody for not being all knowing and all seeing. We know it is now. It is a purposeful act to now put the blinders back on.
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing. And that's irresponsible.
Yeah, I think that's right. I got a call from somebody in a Jewish community where I spoke, and she said, she thinks that a lot of the Jewish community, the mainstream community, is supporting DEI or supporting engagement with DEI, and says we have no choice. And she wanted to host a debate. And so I sat there. This was on the train yesterday on the way back from New York. I sat there going over with her the various people who I thought would take a constructive point of view, that actually engagement with DEI is a good thing, is the right thing, and the like. And it occurred to me that very likely none of those people will agree to having that conversation. Now, I could be wrong, and I hope to be wrong, because either you or me will probably end up in that community in a very fruitful conversation that needs to be had about it. But the fact that I'm worried that none of those organizations would deign to have the conversation because they're going to platform us, or because they're going to normalize the point of view that maybe DEI isn't good for the Jews. I mean, what do they think? Like, are you serious? And I worry that that's exactly what's going to happen.
I hope not. I mean, I hope it doesn't. I think that liberalism dies when people are afraid to have conversations, and if that's the direction we're going, this is going to look a whole lot worse in the months and years to come.
Well, I'm waiting to be proven wrong. Maybe it's my turn to be the pessimist and your turn to be the optimist on this one. I'm waiting to be wrong on that, because I think it's really important that conversation take place. There's certain conversations that once they take place, and maybe this is what they're really worried about, is that they know that we'll win the day. It's like there was a Jewish day school teacher whom we both know who decided to present, in addition to Ibram X. Kendi, John McWhorter, and Glenn Lowry, to his students. And they had the conversation, and then the kids all flocked to John McWhorter and Glenn Lowry because, they had never been presented that as an option. And once they heard the other option, they liked it better. And I worry that some of these organizations that are trying to suppress this conversation know that the rank and file people are likely to gravitate toward our point of view. They don't, fine. You don't have to. I mean, some won't, but a lot will, and that will put pressure on them, pressure that's going to be built up anyway, to change their stance on DEI, and to go from an engagement approach to an opposition or transform approach. And I think that they're scared that could happen, and that's why they're ducking the debate. People who duck debates often worry that they're going to lose the debate, at least in the eyes of the audience.
I agree with that. I think it raises another question for me, whether they're actually true believers in the ideology. Like, are we just speaking to different audiences? Is the audience of an individual organization that is really trying to hold on to the pre-October 7th idea of what's progressive or what's liberal, and they're still trying to hold on to it so tightly in their clutches? Is it because they actually agree with that ideology?
I think it's a small percentage of them. That's my experience, that are true believers. And most of them just know that if they switch gears, it will mean a loss of social capital. It will mean a change for them that they don't want to make, that they don't have the confidence to make, the moral and political confidence to make. And I think that's why this is hard. And by the way, we should not underplay it, because if you do make this change the way we have, it really will rock your world. It really will change who your partners are. It really will reposition you in society. I'm arguing that you start doing that. And if October 7th wasn't a wake-up call, no time will be. But I think that some aren't willing to make that shift. Organizations are notoriously hard to change. There's always inertia. As someone who's been in the organizational development world and watched that inertia in various institutions and the like. So I know how hard it is to shift an organization's fundamental direction. And I don't think it's happening. And unfortunately, they're going to face the marketplace, I believe, in the long run, when more and more American Jews say, this is not working for me. You're not standing up for me and my children in K through 12 school or in colleges because you're not willing to do what we all know is necessary. Anyway, with that, Brandy, thank you. Have a great trip in California. Good luck with the film screening, which is sold out, by the way, the Eli Steele film, Killing
And if
America.
I could say quickly, and we're planning future screenings in San Francisco and LA, San Diego, and New York. So we're looking forward to bringing it to as many places as possible.
Yeah, that exactly. I think that's going to be amazing. And I think it really tells the story powerfully. It's what's happened in a community or a part of the country, but now is spread in other places as well. And I think it'll speak volumes to them. All right. Beautiful. Have a great weekend. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Shabbat Shalom, Brandy.
Shabbat Shalom.